I mean, I spent a career at the Fed, and I think it has real value, but its scope increased to where it is now dominating parts of the market. It's not it's not a institution that provides liquidity in a crisis. It's now the market maker in many areas.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. Well, we've got a new U.S. presidential administration with a very different economic strategy than its predecessor. The president has already started vocally demanding that the Federal Reserve be more aggressive in lowering interest rates, and he's appointed a new head, Scott Bessent, at the US Treasury, replacing Janet Yellen. What should we expect from the policies this administration intends to pursue? Will Jerome Powell march to the president's demands, or will he flex to assert the Fed's independence? And where does inflation figure into all this? For a true experts-informed perspective on these very important questions, we've got the great privilege today of speaking with Dr. Thomas Hoenig, former CEO of the Kansas City Fed, former voting member of the Federal Open Markets Committee, a former director of the FDIC, and now a distinguished senior fellow at the Mercatus Center. Dr. Hoenig, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Well, it's always very wonderful talking with you, Dr. Hoenig. And I do have to note too, I should start here with a thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our upcoming Thoughtful Money Spring Online Conference. You will be joined in conversation by Danielle DiMartino Booth, who herself is a former advisor to the Federal Reserve. I think it was the Dallas Fed. But anyways, you two had a great discussion in our fall conference, and we're going to pick up right where we left off. So thank you for making yourself available for that.
Yeah, she's a good friend and a great interviewer, so I look forward to it.
Okay, great. Well, I do too. I always learn so much when I hear you two talk. All right. Well, look, as I mentioned in the intro, there's a lot of new things to talk about since we last had you on the program. So I'd like to dig into each of those with you. But if we can, let's just start with the general question I like to kick these discussions off with.
Sure.
What's your current assessment of the global economy and financial markets?
Well, I think that's a hard question in many ways, because from first perspective, on the U.S. economy, which really drives much of the global economy, the U.S. economy is strong. I mean, it's leaving 2024 in a very strong record, and it's entering 2025 with a strong record. And I would expect that will continue. I think the consumer is still consuming, and our nominal and real wages are still improving. That means the consumer should be able to stay engaged. Investment is really generally good. It's been growing, and I suspect it will grow even more as the demand for technology increases and so forth. So I think the U.S. will have a very strong year. Now, the rest of the world is a little less, shall we say, strong. That's putting it nicely. Europe is struggling. It has been for some time, and I think it will going forward. China, which, besides all the other issues between the U.S. and China itself, is having some adjustment issues that it has to get through. It's been very kind of deflationary move. So that is going to continue, I think, for a while, despite recent events. And I think the economies to our north, Canada and Mexico, are also less, shall we say, robust than U.S. So it's really the U.S. and then the world following that. But I am optimistic about the U.S. economy going forward and all this going on there. So that's kind of my broad assessment of the U.S. and global economies.
Okay. And I know you're more of an economist. You look at the economy much more than you look at the financial markets. But do you have an opinion on the current state of the financial markets?
Well, I think the financial markets are stable, but I think they're vulnerable. There's a lot of leverage. There's a lot of, shall we say, uncertainty around the global economy, and therefore a little bit also of uncertainty around the presidential transition and what the future holds. So I think those are issues that could change things. For example, the banking industry in the United States There's a great deal of talk about how well capitalized it is. It is capitalized better than it was before, but it still has, growing non-performing assets, especially in the commercial real estate field and some other fields. So it's not it's not as robust as I think people say, but it is stable, and that's essential for the growth overall of the U.S. economy. It has to be there, and it is. And I think that will continue unless there's a major shock to the global or to the U.S. economy, which I don't see coming.
Okay. Got to remind listeners that you were a former director of the FDIC, so you know the banking system much better than your average bear. And I might want to pull on a thread or two there about
Sure,
the state of the banking system. But let's find our way there.
sure.
Very quickly, just to unfairly put you on the spot for a moment, I interviewed for the first time Richard Koo from Nomura Bank, who used to work at the New York Fed.
Uh-huh.
As you may remember, Lacey Hunt is going to keynote our coming March spring conference. It would be really interesting at some point to get you all on camera together and listen to you guys bat ideas around, because I ask the best questions I can think of, but they really do come from a layman's standpoint. I'd be fascinated to hear what you inside experts on the central planning side thing.
Sure.
I'm sure you can think of questions to ask each other that I would never think of.
Well, or challenge one another.
Yeah,
In
which I think
terms
would
of
be
our
really
answers.
instrumental for everybody.
Sure,
Yeah,
that makes for a very healthy discussion and maybe better predictions as a result. More
all
balanced.
right. Well, we'll see if we can't make that happen. And folks, if you think that
Okay,
would be of interest to you, let me know in the comment section below. And if there's enough interest, I'll see if we can make something happen at some point this year.
sounds good.
Okay. So before we get to the details of the banking system, let's start with some of the questions that I raised in the intro there.
Sure.
So obviously we have a new presidential administration. Seems to have a very different playbook, very different set of priorities than the previous administration. Trump clearly not afraid of being a disruptor and has already sort of proved that in spades in his first week and a half in
Yes.
office. What do you think about at least what we know of the announced policies so far? What are you expecting to be different now that we have this specific administration in place?
Well, I do think that number one, there'll be a very strong emphasis on reducing government costs. Whether you refer to it as waste or whatever, it's like any CEO coming into a company and wanting to get the costs down or the expenses down. So there's going to be a heavy emphasis. You've already seen that. Freezing spending, laying off people. I think that's part of it. Now, the real challenge, though, that this administration and any administration has with the U.S. economy is addressing its total spending. Now, when you do that and think about it, that's still a challenge. We have to see how it's going to be handled. Because remember, almost 2/3 of the government spending is entitlements, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are things that this administration, like others, has committed not to cut. And so if that's 2/3 of your spending, then another big percent of it is defense. And so how are you going to cut defense when the world is at such stress points? So that's, I think, very important. Then another big expense is interest on the debt. And even if the interest rates come down modestly, you still have almost $1 trillion of interest expense a year, which is actually as large as the defense spending.
Right.
So those are issues that I don't know how they're going to handle yet. They're committed to more efficiency in government, but there's still an overarching commitment to spending a great deal of money, and that means continuing a large deficit, and that's the challenge that they have yet to really address explicitly or specifically. So we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. And I'm asking you to speculate here a bit, but do you see them as being successful in actually reducing spending at all in 2025? Or is it going to be more of sort of a reshuffling year, which is we're just going to spend better, right? We're going to shift money from programs that we don't think are very efficient, but maybe, invest more in AI. Obviously, Trump's basically said, there's no cost to national security, or there's no price you can put on national security. So we're going to do everything it takes to, deport illegals that have criminal records and that type of stuff.
Yeah. I think that the spending spending reductions will be modest, to be honest, because I can't see, I mean, you could eliminate an agency and you're still not going to bring the debt down
Right.
dramatically.
Because of what you talked about earlier, those big
Bingo.
buckets at the beginning, if you're not touching those, the rest is window dressing.
Exactly.
Right?
It's and I think I mean, you think about it, with a $2 trillion deficit, you can get that expenses in an agency down, you can lay people off, and you can bring those costs down. You can reduce it, but you'll reduce the size of the increase. You won't eliminate the increase in the spending, and you may make the deficit marginally smaller, but you're not going to eliminate the deficit anytime soon with the spending commitments that are clearly out there to be honored.
Okay. This is usually a question I get to near the end of the conversation, but why don't we just pull it up now? Let's roll up our sleeves and grab this third rail. So you understand the finances of the country better than most people, given your past positions. Can we? I mean, let me put it this way: is there a path through the future here where we are able to honor all these entitlement commitments and get the books in better shape and get America to a more sustainable financial trajectory? Or is there a reckoning ahead when it comes to entitlements? I mean, we have been deficit spending forever, right? A little tiny blip of a surplus during the Clinton era. Our debts have grown exponentially faster than our GDP as a country.
Yeah.
Is there any way out of this without having to have some sort of default on the promises that have been made to the American people, or at least that people are expecting? And by default, I mean either, hey, you're going to get less, or we're going to have to do things like means testing or increase the age of Social Security, or we're just going to pay everybody a little bit less or whatever, or a default by, yeah, we'll pay you what we said we're going to pay you, but we're increasing the money supply so much that the purchasing power isn't going to be that meaningful.
Those are the trade-offs. Those are the risks that lie ahead. I say, number one, yes, you can address the issue without inflating your way out, but it is not simple or easy. Number one, and I don't think this administration is interested in raising taxes, because that's one way you do it. Right now, we spend about the equivalent of, I'm going to round numbers, but equivalent of 25% of GDP. We have revenue that's about 17, 18%. So what do? You either cut spending or raise revenue. So those are your choices. Now, there are many, even conservatives, saying that, well, we should do both. Well, that is a choice. You can do both. That might be the compromise in the end. I don't know. However, that difference between 18 and 25 is a pretty big difference. So I don't see how you do it without saying we need to tighten our belts in a shared sacrifice manner. And that is, if you start saying we're going to cut one thing and not another, we're only going to look at one area, then the lobbyists will swarm over you, because the rent seekers have something at stake here. So you're going to have to say we're looking at everything. We're going to make systematic cuts, and we're going to talk about raising revenue or not. Let's get that on the table. Are we going to do it only by spending cuts, or are we going to do it by the combination of two? Question number one. Question number two, once we make that choice, what's the process we're going to go through to do it? And frankly, from my perspective, and I'm one of those Social Security receivers just because of my age. Should this age group be able to retire at 65, or should it be 67, 68, 69? That has a big impact on those on that spending commitment? Those are the questions that lie ahead. I just don't think you can do it by, you know, being more efficient as a bureaucracy is very important. I support it, but that's not going to solve the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, not enough in and of itself.
Yeah.
What do they say? Necessary but insufficient,
Yeah,
right? It's
necessary,
part of the solution, but won't solve the problem in and of
well,
itself.
and it's part of the shared sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's in this.
And let me ask you about that. So, I'm going to ask you again to postulate here, given your knowledge not just of markets but of human behavior. So we'll call this in the behavioral economics realm. Human nature generally tends to be, we don't like to change our behavior, right?
Exactly.
We only change when the pain of continuing the status quo begins to exceed the pain of change, right? So the classic example is you don't change your lifestyle, your eating, your fitness habits until you have the first heart attack scare, right?
Right.
Could we have a president or could we have elected officials succeed and especially even get elected to office on a mandate for shared sacrifice? Or are we going to need more pain before the population wakes up for that? Are we going to need, not necessarily to get as bad as Argentina, but get to a point where you say, look, we've tried it every other way. All right, get the chainsaw guy now. Like now we're willing to try that because what we have now just really hurts, right?
Right. Well, good question. Hard to answer. It's up to leadership. I think that the leadership, the administration, the Congress, if they were to come to grips with this and say, we're not just going to, try and make things more efficient. We're going to take a hard look at these things, but we're going to do it for all. We're going to systematically look at our spending. For example, there are so many subsidies out there. And if you ask me, am I going to give something up on my own and then have everyone else, I really want to reduce the deficit as long as you pay for it?
Right.
Or are we going to cut these subsidies that are dramatic and significant, and in doing that, also cut some other areas that brings us more in balance? We don't have to necessarily run a surplus to, over time, bring things back to order. We have to systematically, though, begin to narrow that difference between how much we take in and how much we spend. Now, what that does, it does a couple things. Number one, it does narrow the difference. But number two, it changes attitudes and it changes confidence in investing in the future and in saving again. And that builds the base for bringing yourself back into equilibrium, shall I say, spending and revenues back into equilibrium over time in a confident way that's successful. Now, the other way that you can do it and kick the can down the road is inflate your way out. They say, if you can if you can bring it down enough to where with inflation, your debt to GDP number declines. Well, yeah, you can do it that way too. But what you're going to do is undermine your future in that approach, I think. So I prefer the first method. It takes real leadership and it takes explaining it to the public, because you're right. Human nature is such, I'm not going to give mine up if they're not willing to give up theirs. And that means the leadership has to say, this is how we're approaching it, and we are going to stick to it. And a little bit, that's what, believe it or not, Gingrich and Clinton, who are not exactly buddies, were able to come to a compromise and over a 4-year period bring us to a modest surplus in our spending. So it's doable. It's harder now than it was with them because our debt is so much greater. Our deficit is much greater. So it's going to take even more determination.
Yeah, I was going to say that the debt and deficits, back then looked positively quaint compared to
where they are today.
Yeah. And look, I'll just register my own opinion, one man's opinion, but I just don't see Americans, I don't see us sadly being anywhere close to being willing to do that kind of shared sacrifice yet, just because the pain isn't there. The behavior is much more about spend for today, what can I get from my government
Right.
type of deal. And I don't see, honestly, I mean, I'm encouraged by the current fleet of politicians coming in with a more fiscally responsible mindset. But I still don't necessarily see a politician willing yet to say, hey, I'm going to push for austerity versus the easy solution, which is the inflate part. But we'll see. I would love to be proven
And
wrong.
remember, we have become a culture of instant gratification. So the culture has changed. And
Yes.
so you have to slowly change the culture or speedily change the culture. And crisis does it speedily wise. And that's what I hate to see. But you're right. That is a real probability. Now, that's down the road a ways. And so we'll spin ourselves into, I think, a crisis if someone doesn't say time to act sooner and the leadership coming together on that, which I know, like I tend to agree with you on your point.
Okay. All right. Well, look, let's hope that it doesn't get to that point, but let's be pragmatists about it. All right. So so you said basically you've got either cut spending or you've got to raise revenue, right? And one of the sort of novel, call it more interesting ideas that the president has just floated is, hey, like we run trade deficits with all these other countries. They're getting a sweet deal, making money off of us. Those guys should pay more. And he floated the idea of an external revenue service. Just the other day said, hey, maybe we'll make so much money with that we won't even need an internal revenue service, and nobody has to pay income taxes anymore. Well, if you have any reaction to either of those, I'd love to hear it. But more the question I just want to ask you is how much of a part of this process of balancing the books could be America flexing and saying, look, like it or not, everybody likes to do business with us. Everybody likes to be on our good side. You all have to pay a little bit more, and using those excess revenues to at least reduce some of the gap.
Well, tariffs were a part of our budget in the 19th century, a big part of it. You can do that. Now, it's another way of saying to the American people, you're going to have some sacrifice, because tariffs, I know the supply and demand relationships, but tariffs means that's a tax, and Americans will pay the tax. So they will pay higher prices for goods. Now, the thought is that the countries who are exporting to us will reduce their prices, or the dollar will appreciate to make that less painful. But the fact of the matter is, you're going to pay a tax, and the tax will increase revenues, is the thought, assuming that the tax isn't so hard that you slow the economy.
Right.
Number one. Number two, part of the reason we have these huge trade deficits with the rest of the world is our own fault. I mean, you don't run interest rates and encourage consumption at zero interest rates without consequences. And so, yeah, we imported from China with very cheap goods, but we exported those dollars and had them come back to us, and we printed money that enabled us to do that at extreme levels. So yeah, we ran huge deficits because we like instant gratification. We like more for cheaper. So I think as long as our goal is to encourage strong consumption through low interest rates, we're going to have a challenge balancing our trade. It's not just the rest of the world taking advantage of us. It's us wanting to spend more than we produce. And remember, a trade deficit by definition is we are consuming more than we're producing.
Right.
A choice we're making. So that's important.
So very good point. This kind of goes back to almost your point about culture. This is less social culture and more sort of sovereign culture, where, where we wanted our cake and making the rest of the world serve it to us here.
Right.
Let me ask you this.
It's wonderful to be the reserve currency. You get to run your debts up more than other countries.
Right. It's a grand privilege that America enjoys, and people can definitely debate with good reasons whether it's fair or not.
Right.
But I think Trump is saying, hey, look, my job is to use all of America's advantages as best I can for the interests of the American people, right? So, I think he's looking to say, how can I use all these things to get as much from our foreign trade partners without breaking something, right? Without taking it too far. Now, as I understand it, one of the elements of the threat of tariffs is, hey, pay up to play, right? But there are ways you can avoid these tariffs, right? If you want to sell your goods to us, well, why don't you build your manufacturing plant here in the U.S. and create U.S. jobs? So I'm just curious. I don't think, unless you want to clarify, I don't think you're necessarily anti the strategy. It's maybe more the application of the strategy. But are there good elements to what he's trying to do here? Are these worthy of at least considering, in terms of how America should be running things?
Well, to me, it's one approach to it that he's choosing in terms of tariffs and flexing your muscles because the world's become dependent on our dollar. Now, I think the problem is that tariffs distort the allocation, but so does zero interest rates. So
Right.
what's the right balance? So yeah, there may be. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how I think about trade, open trade, and so forth. If you think about it, the United States is a free trade zone, right? Because what we decided on was, number one, we wanted free trade. So we passed a law called the Constitution that insisted on free trade, and we enforced the law. So you can't cheat easily. Let me put it that way. It's one state. Now states try, but you have a means to protect yourself. So if we had a world in which there was a rule of law that was truly enforceable, but the World Trade Organization isn't strong enough, and so with this open trade, you have cheaters. So if Trump is saying we want to stop the cheaters from cheating, who would disagree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the goal? By imposing tariffs that punish the cheater? Okay, that's something to think about. But on balance, if we conducted a monetary and fiscal policy as a nation that was sound over the long term, and you had international trade agreements that were enforceable, then free trade is the best way. But those are big conditions. Number one, we don't have a responsible fiscal policy. We have a history, in my opinion, people disagree with me on this, of a very less than responsible monetary policy. And we have cheaters in trade, they and us. So with those conditions, it's a much more difficult problem to solve. And tariffs are one element of it, but so is good fiscal policy and good monetary policy.
Fair policy.
And if you had those, then I think your balances would be more in balance. You wouldn't be running these huge trade deficits.
Great explanation. And look, I'm not trying to lean one way or the other in terms of where the Trump administration is. But I think, my guess is if Trump were here, he would say, well, Tom, that's what I'm trying to do, with these tariffs, is to try to get the cheaters in line, right? I'm trying to go, not trying to be the bully shaking everybody down, on the playground, but I'm trying to make sure that the guys that are getting more than their fair share pay up, right?
Right.
Now, he would say on the fiscal side, hey, Tom, hear ya, Doge, everything, we're trying to get costs under control here, right? But on the monetary side, I hear him saying, Jerome Powell, bring those interest rates down. Right?
That's right. Typical.
Yeah.
Everyone wants low interest rates. Everyone does, except the consequences have to be thought through. And that's the hard part. That's like fiscal policy, really. The consequences have not been thought through by the Congress of the United States.
Yeah. So, well, let's pull on this for a second. So,
Okay.
Trump and Powell have a bit of a checkered relationship.
Yes.
Trump appointed him, and Trump also threatened to fire him, which is hard to do. and I'm probably highly unlikely, unless you want to correct that, but probably highly unlikely that Powell will get fired, and so he'll probably finish serving his term out, which ends what, middle of next year?
May of next year, I think.
May of next year, yeah. So a couple questions around this. One, um, I'm sure Powell doesn't like hearing the president directly call him out and say, "Here's what you should do." But Powell has a history, and this may not be fair. Maybe it's more nuanced than this, but we basically sort of had the same thing happen several years ago, into the Trump administration, and Powell basically said, "Look, Fed's independent. We're not going to be pushed around." And then he got called to the White House, and not long after that was the famous Powell pivot during the Trump first administration. So, the question is what do you expect their dynamic to be here? Is it going to be more a dance of partnership, or is it going to be more of a dance of adversaries where Trump is trying to force Powell's hand, and Powell is saying, "Not this time, I'm independent"?
Well, let me back up first, and just a little bit of history. This is not new to the Fed. I mean, presidents have pushed Fed chairs since after at least 3 or 4 times after World War II.
Yeah, literally pushed like against a wall, famously.
Exactly.
Right? Johnson. Yeah.
Johnson, and then Nixon, telephone call with Burns. I mean, it was, "I want this," and got it. So it's not new. And people say he pivoted. Yes, maybe, maybe not. Who knows for sure? Only history will tell. But I think the record, it's not clear what's going to happen here. Because number one, I don't know I wasn't there, but if I understand it is, if inflation comes down, Trump is saying, "I'm going to get inflation down and I'm going to demand the Fed lower rates." Well, if you get inflation down, all right, then there is room for the Fed perhaps to get interest rates down. So it wouldn't be inconsistent. My fear is that you don't get inflation down, but you still push to get interest rates down. And so you invite inflation, and you invite your solution being you inflate your way out of the so-called deficit. That would be, I think, long run harmful to the United States. So I think if Powell does his job, he has to say, "We're not lowering interest rates unless inflation comes down." And right now, inflation is too high. It's still well over 2%. And from my perspective, 2% inflation is too high.
Right.
Okay. So he has to say, inflation has to come down. We're not lowering interest rates, because right now, if you think about where real interest rates are, so what am I talking about? That is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. The nominal interest rate is the policy rate is what, 4.25% approximately. Inflation is still 2.5% at least. So you have real interest rates below 2%. In my opinion, that's not restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
At best, that's neutral and might even be somewhat stimulative. And if that's the case, inflation right now between 2.5% and 3% is likely to stay there. So you don't have a case for lowering rates. So it's up to Powell to explain that, and to the FOMC to explain that to the administration and to the American people. That's their challenge. Now, if Trump says, "I don't take that, I want it lower anyway," well, then the independence of the Fed has to be exercised, even if it's threatened. Again, it won't be the first time, again. And then that'll be Powell's test. How he will react, I can't tell you. I don't know. I'm not there, but I do know the pressure, and the pressure will be great. So my best hope is that inflation comes down, but I don't see how it can, given the current policy rate and the current level of inflation.
Okay. Do you think that Powell, how would you rate his recent performance? And by recent performance, let's start by when he pivoted, and we had the initial 50 basis point cut,
Right.
and then we had several more cuts from there. While during the process, people were asking the question, hey, economy's growing strong, markets are at all-time highs,
Right.
inflation is sticky. Is this really the time to be cutting?
I think he was over aggressive on the cuts. Had he cut 25 basis points, I think the world would have accepted that because inflation had come down. At that level, the real rates were not eased. They were modestly restrictive. That means you would be anticipating that inflation would continue to come down and that you were kind of shooting at a moving target and you were shooting ahead of it to get it right. But the 50 basis point was aggressive. It caught people off guard and it did lower rates dramatically. I think the other where I would have been, I would have disagreed is on the last cut, because by then we'd already moved rates down 75 basis points. So now they were more in a neutral zone by any reasonable estimate, maybe modestly restrictive. I don't even know that it was, but cutting it again made it clearly neutral or modestly ease. So now what's he going to do with the pressure coming at him? I don't know. But I think had he done 50 basis points, and I think it'd be more likely inflation would continue down. But he's focused on employment. And that, I think, took the ball off inflation. And we're at a greater risk of inflation not coming down. The question I always get asked at this time is this a repeat of the 70s? Well, it now has similarities to that. We'll see how it plays out. But in the 70s, they lowered rates in anticipation and inflation reignited. We'll have to see how the inflation numbers come out in the next 2 months or so. That will tell us a lot. I'm hoping that I'm wrong and that inflation does come down. But I think it's right now in a steady state. We'll see.
All right, inflation at steady state. So if that's the case, let's assume for a moment that Trump just puts a whole lot of pressure on Powell because he wants lower rates. And let's assume for a moment that Powell capitulates on that. There's been a lot of debate on this channel, people arguing different sides about whether we really need to worry about that inflation-wise. And people will point to where inflation was during the era of QE 1, 2, 3, and forever, right? Where we had a lot of monetary QE, but it didn't really, at least the way the government measures it, get reflected in the real economy. And one could even argue that the excessive or the exceptional measures the Fed took during COVID maybe didn't even have that much of an impact on inflation as well. And we really only saw inflation spike hard when the fiscal side kicked in and we were sending direct checks to households and whatnot.
Sure.
So what is your experiential point of view in terms of the relationship between the Fed's efforts and inflation? And maybe I should be more specific in this. I think this debate's been largely more on QE versus interest rates, but let's even put interest rates in the mix. How much should we worry about a Fed continuing to cut, restoking inflation versus what could be done on the fiscal side?
Well, let me first start with the idea of that period where we didn't have inflation after QE. Number one, in my opinion, monetary policy is about more than just inflation, the lags and so forth. It does affect the allocation of resources in an economy. And when we had QE and interest rates at almost zero, we were really fooling around with relative prices in the economy. And I think adversely affecting the economy. For example, So we did not have consumer inflation. Yeah, we were importing like crazy from China at very favorable prices,
Mhm.
but asset inflation was running.
Yeah, we did have asset inflation,
Well,
absolutely.
and guess what? That that redistributed wealth,
Yeah.
relative wealth. So so that if you had assets, you became wealthier just by having assets.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of hedge fund guys that admit that. And there's a stock market that shows that. And there's a housing market that now young people can't afford to get into because of the high price of housing and they say high interest rates, but it's primarily because of the high price of housing that's went on for many years. So that's, I think, important to remember when you talk about we didn't have inflation. Well, we did have inflation, and we did have some real, I'd say, harm done to this economy in that period. So I'm not going to back off of that. That's number one. Number two, deficits it wasn't just that we had deficits in the earlier period, but we did do helicopter money. We did just write checks to everyone and say, spend it. Well, even, they increased their savings, but they still had more money than they ever had before, and they were spending it. So that did accelerate the inflation impulse beyond assets into goods and services, number one. Number two, not only did we print money and have fiscal policy, we were already in controversy with the rest of the world, and our prices were rising generally. So I think, bad policy isn't solved with more bad policy. And so I would not be printing money like crazy at the moment, restoking the inflation of assets as you try and make sure the stock market stays strong. Those are not the answers to this question. And that doesn't solve the difference between how much we take in this country and how much we spend as a nation. That's where the focus should be. And monetary policy should not accommodate that deficit. And it's going to have a lot of pressure coming forward, I promise you, because right now, there's a lot of excess liquidity that's been able to fund the growing national debt. That's beginning to come down. And yet the national debt's going to continue high, at least for the next year or so. And someone has to buy that debt. Is the rest of the world going to buy that debt? Well, maybe not as readily as they have before. We've seen some backing off of that. So that means the U.S. domestic market, consumers, businesses, will have to buy that debt. And how do you get them to buy more debt? You have to raise interest rates.
You have to raise the yield, yeah.
And the other option is have the Fed buy it, like they did with the last big increase in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
The Fed bought most of that debt.
Right, but you would be against that.
I would be violent against that because inflation follows.
Yeah.
Asset and or prices generally.
So, Dr. Hoenig, thank you. You always remind me when we talk why, you would be my hands down pick for new Fed head, given the way that you look at the world. And I could have used you this past weekend. I was in a prolonged debate about the impact and repercussions of QE, and I was much of what you said echoed my arguments. You just said it a lot more eloquently than I did.
No, not really, but thank you.
No, you did. And I do want to give credit to David Stockman, who you may know.
I know David very well.
Okay, so you may know of his book, The Great Deformation, which I thought was such a spot-on description of what central planning intervention excess is. And since he came up with that term, I think I think the government machine said, "You think that's deformation? Hold my beer," right? But I hear that's sort of mostly what you're railing at here, which is when central planning gets in and mucks too much around with natural market forces, you get a lot of unintended consequences. You end up obviously with a huge pile of debt, big deficits, but you get things like exacerbation of the wealth divide, where
Yes.
policy begins to favor certain parties. And as I've said many times here, over the past 20 years, agree or not in the moment with central planning policy decisions that were made, it's pretty undeniable that the beneficiary of those policies each time was the already rich,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah,
It,
and I
I
know
mean,
you have concerns about the long-term toxic effect that has on
yes,
society.
yes, it does. And I think that central planners, well, you know my view, central planners cannot take in all the considerations. And I think I'm a Fed. I mean, I spent a career at the Fed, and I think it has real value, but its scope increased to where it is now dominating parts of the market. It's not it's not a institution that provides liquidity in a crisis. It's now the market maker in many areas. The government securities market. Oh, we have to have a functioning securities market. US Treasuries have to trade, and we're going to intervene to make sure it does. Well, wait a minute. What about the market? What about teaching banks to be careful with their liquidity? Teaching individuals that you can't just solve everything by printing more money. You need rational policies, because printing money allowed the debt to get to where it is today. No question about it. And it'll be the challenge, because the Congressional Budget Office, who does not, I'd say, is very cautious in their projections, as far as they're very optimistic, put it another way, is projecting a $50 trillion deficit at the end of the decade.
I know.
I mean,
It's just
not deficit, debt.
debt.
$50 trillion debt at the end of the decade. Well, guess what? You're going to have to print a lot of money to accommodate that. And that's the challenge that lies ahead for the Federal Reserve. Because if you don't, well, the Treasury market will be disrupted. The Treasury won't be able to auction as easily. On and on it goes. Well, maybe that's what you need to say. We're not going to do that, so that you begin to address this problem.
Stop being the enabler. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
You come in and help create the problem, and then you're the enabler that keeps perpetuating
Keeps
it.
it going. Yep.
When you're talking, when I edit this, when you were talking there, I'll try to put up that chart of the debt growth that you were referring to.
Yep.
It is a frightening chart.
Yes, it is.
And as you said, it's probably overly optimistic.
Exactly. It is overly optimistic. Unless the difference between our spending and our revenues narrows, it's overly optimistic.
Yeah, I feel like as a nation, we should kind of adopt and edit the motto from the British underground, right? It's mind the gap, right?
Yep.
Ours
Yep.
should be
Mind the
close
gap.
the gap, right?
Yep.
We should just that's what the nation just should be thinking about. How do we
Well,
close the gap?
If we don't address that, we're not going to be able to jump to the car. It's too big a gap.
Good way to put it. All right, last question, then we'll start wrapping up here. I talked about Powell likely serving through the end of his term, but then he'd need to be replaced, obviously. I mean, he could be extended. I'm going to guess you don't think odds are high that Powell is going to let him have another term. Yeah. Who do you think may replace him? I've heard a couple names batted around, Kevin Warsh being one of them, but do you have anyone that you see as sort of a likely successor to Powell?
I don't. I have no idea. I mean, Kevin's been in that group. Austin Goolsbee could be in that group. Excuse me, not Austin, the wrong president. But Powell. I mean, Kevin Warsh could be, but I don't see a long list at the moment. And they may be gathering it right now, but I don't know.
All right. I don't want to unfairly put you on the spot, so feel free to just punt. But is there anybody that you would like to see there, particularly?
Well, I need, well, I think it would be interesting to have John Cochrane there, to be honest with you.
Okay, and why?
Well, he's a very, he's a dynamic economist. He is very convinced that the fiscal side is the challenge to monetary policy.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I think he would be willing to speak as a monetary policy guy. He would be actually able and willing to speak out on the fiscal side so that you bring the two into greater balance. And he knows monetary policy as well.
Okay. So I was interviewing Michael Howell last week, who his big focus is liquidity. And he put up a chart that his firm puts together, and I apologize for not having it here for you to view, but it showed sort of what he was calling like shadow QE, shadow liquidity, that the Fed and the Treasury working together provided over the past several years, which when you add it up on a net basis, along with the Fed tightening and the QT that's been going on, liquidity was actually still increasing in the system versus decreasing, right? So a lot of us think, oh, the Fed was hiking rates and it was doing QT, therefore it's draining the pool. And yes, those efforts do that, but then it was also draining the reverse repo program.
Right.
Yellen was providing funding from the TGA. There was the bank term funding program. All these things that actually were net positive liquidity-wise, and by at least Michael's calculations, were net positive over much of that time, which is in many reasons why some people attribute to we were expecting lag effects in the economy from rising interest rates and things like that. And everybody was expecting recession going into 2023. And then we had two gangbuster years in the economy and the markets went on fire. And an explanation of that could have been, well, liquidity was actually net positive, right? Where I'm going with this is what type of partner for the Fed do you think Scott Bessent will be at Treasury? You mentioned that John Cochrane sort of looks at the fiscal side as being more the big problem that has to get under control. Does Bessent have a similar mindset? Would he be working in conjunction with the Fed, or do you think they might be at odds?
That's a hard question to answer because I think Bessent understands what the issues are. I mean, it's not something he's unfamiliar with. He's very familiar with it. So I think he would, number one, understand and agree with a person like John Cochrane. The problem is you still have to fund the debt.
Mm-hmm.
And when you stand where you sit, right? And so you're Secretary of the Treasury, you have this $2 trillion deficit and the refinancing of about $9 trillion to deal with. How are you going to deal with it? Are you going to let interest rates rise to get the private sector to move capital from the private sector into funding the national debt? Or are you going to say, well, wait a minute, we can't have interest rates going up. The Fed has to help us here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's his dilemma ahead. I don't know how.
Right, especially with his boss shouting in his ear, "Get those interest rates. Tell the Fed to get the interest rate down."
and remember, here's the hardest part. Maybe can for the Fed to be able to bring the 10-year down? What's it have to do? It has to extend its duration. So it has to not only not let the long end of its holdings run off, it has to extend those to keep the 10-year rate down. It has to buy that supply in order to keep the rates from rising. And will you really do that? Will you really do that? Because that means you're buying debt and you're buying the long end, you're doing duration, you're reallocating again, you're doing QE. Those are all things that have long-term, I think, adverse consequences. But to fund the debt, now I think part of the argument would be this is temporary, right? We got to get through this to where we can get the government back into better shape, and we have to do all these right things, and that would be part of his argument, I would expect. But I have a very bad experience with promises of short term. This is only the short term. Remember, I mean, QE was a short-term solution. That's now
taking the dollar off the gold standard was a temporary solution.
Temporary. So I don't envy him the choices that he has to make, and I don't envy Powell the choices they have to make. And I don't know how they're going to work through it. I don't know them well enough to anticipate that.
Okay.
So I do know the pressure they're going to be under, though.
Yeah. What I detect from you is, hey, it's going to be a volatile time. There's a lot of uncertainty. that even a highly experienced person like yourself, who's sit at the top of the monetary system and the banking system, has a lot of open questions. All right, so I've got one last big question for you around that, Tom, but before I ask it, yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
make one other point?
Please.
And remember, that's the point of the problems of central planning. It depends on individuals, and you don't know how they're all going to react
Going to
under
react.
certain circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, which is, you know, it throws the behavioral element back in, right? Which is always the wild card.
Bingo.
Okay, so for folks that have really enjoyed this discussion, Tom, and would like to follow you in your work, where should they go?
We're at Mercatus. We have our own podcast called Thin Red Rag, which people can go, and I write for that occasionally.
All right, fantastic. When I edit this, I will put up links to that on the screen.
Sure.
And also, folks, I'll have links in the description below this video too, so you can get to those with just one link, one click. And don't forget, everybody watching, that Tom is going to be back on the channel here again in a little under 2 months at the Thoughtful Money Spring Online Conference. And again, he's going to be in discussion there with Danielle DiMartino Booth. It's going to be fascinating. And if you enjoyed this discussion, Danielle is way smarter than I in terms of how to bring the best out of Tom. So you're going to love that conversation. To go get your tickets for the conference, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com/conference. And a reminder, right now we are offering tickets at the early bird discount price. So it's the lowest price we're going to offer. So if you're thinking about coming to the conference, go get your tickets now so you can lock in that lowest price. Also, while you're there at thoughtfulmoney.com, if you'd like to get some guidance and help from one of the financial advisors that we endorse in terms of how to navigate this uncertain period ahead that Tom is referencing, just fill out the short form there. Only takes you a couple seconds. And as a reminder, these consultations are totally free. There's no commitment to work with these firms. It's just a free public service they offer to help as many people as possible, position as prudently as possible for what may lie ahead. All right, Tom. So in concluding here, this video is watched mostly, there are professional investors for sure that watch, but it's mostly regular people who are just trying to build wealth,
Sure.
working hard to build wealth. They're not head economists. They're not Wall Street power investors. They're really just trying to prudently build wealth for they and their families' futures. But probably even more importantly, they don't want to get steamrolled by some sort of systemic breakage or shock from some of these risks that we've been talking about here. Do you have any bit of just sort of parting bits of advice you'd offer those people, given your view of the roadmap ahead?
Well, I think it's back to the oldest advice anyone's given. You have to diversify. And, I think the stock market is very highly elevated in terms of price and earnings, but it's still a reasonable place to put some of your money. Treasuries right now, short end, are safe, and they yield a pretty good return relative to the stock market at the moment. It's really just using your good sense and not getting into, unless, one thing for sure, don't speculate with more than you can afford to lose. So the rest of it is just stay for the long term. I think the stock market for the long term is still a reasonable thing to put part of your money in. I think right now treasuries, the short end, are a reasonable thing to put money in that's safe and still gives you a decent return. Bonds, I wouldn't go out very far yet, because I think that's a lot of capital loss if the interest rates were to go up, surprisingly. But those are the kinds of things you have to watch. Diversify, be careful, and only speculate on what you can afford to lose.
Very well said, and that's very time-honored advice as well. So thank you for the dose of reality. All right, folks. Well, look, please let Dr. Hoenig know how much you appreciated this discussion by hitting the like button and then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. Tom, it is always just such a pleasure and a privilege to have these discussions with you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much for coming on. Thanks again for coming on in the conference in a bit.
Sure.
And really, it's just a privilege to have you here.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Adam. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.